Okay, so Bio 202, moving on to respiratory system. Now the nice thing about respiratory system coming off of cardiovascular system is that there is a lot of overlap both functionally as well as structurally. So functionally, we know that with cardiovascular system it's about distributing things around the body to and from the cells, and with the respiratory system it's about also transport. This is exchange with the external environment, getting it into the blood, and then allowing the cardiovascular system to transport it to the cells and then around the other way from the cells back out to the external environment. So what we're talking about here is oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now it also has anatomical similarities to cardiovascular system in terms of it being a series of tubes where we are moving something within it according to pressure. And that's something we had seen in terms of a fluid when we were talking about the blood, but now we're talking about a gas. But still, we're getting molecules of substances excuse me, to move from one area to another. Okay, so respiratory system is a pretty simple system. It's fairly compact. We can see that it is found, north, if you will, superior to the diaphragm. And so it's fairly compact. It has only a few organs associated with it, but of course you have to know those organs. So that's mostly what we do in lab, but you do need to know those parts and what they do for lecture. Now here's the crux of the respiratory system, is that in order for the respiratory system to do its job, there are 4 key processes involved. So you need to know each of these 4 processes and how they occur. So what makes, for instance, pulmonary ventilation or breathing occur? How do we get air to move into and out of the lungs? How do we get the gases to exchange between the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries? How do we get these things into and out of the blood? Then transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood, something that we touched on before, but then we hit here. And then finally, the exchange down at the tissue level. So, one of the analogies I use is that when we're talking about the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, etc., it's kind of like the delivery system for the mail or UPS or whatever, right? So it's one thing to actually take it into the neighborhood, but you actually have to make deliveries and pickups with those individual cells or individual houses. And so if you're just zooming through the neighborhood and only doing one of those things or not doing either of those things, then you're not doing your entire job. So you definitely need to know these 4 processes and be able to know the parts that are involved in their functions and how they actually work. Now, half of these occur with the respiratory system, which is newer information. The other half occur with the cardiovascular system, which is technically old information. So again, a nice overlap with cardiovascular system. So we're looking at 2 different types of exchanges. We're looking at the exchanges of the pulmonary gases, the gases at the pulmonary capillaries here, between the alveoli, the bubble-like structures, with all the surface area making up the lungs, and those pulmonary capillaries. So that's external respiration. It's exchange with the external environment. Then we have transport, like we said, and then we have internal respiration, where we have gas exchange with the tissues. So in this case, oxygen is going to be going out to the cells, carbon dioxide is going to be coming back from the cells. So we need to understand how that works. So one of the first things is, okay, how do we get the air to move into and out of the lungs? Like we said, in terms of ventilation of the lungs, breathing. Then how do we get these gases to move into and out of the bloodstream? How do we get them to transport around in the bloodstream? And then finally, how do we get them to move a second time and exchange with the tissues? So knowing the different anatomical parts, like we said, and their particular roles are going to be important. These figures in the textbook are very similar to models that you have in the lab that you'll be going through. We'll also be doing some microscope work, again looking at the cells and layers and tissues involved. In this case, pseudostratified ciliate columnar epithelium. And so this is where our cells that we see here are very unique shaped cells that make it look like there's more than one cell layer, but in fact each of these goes down and touches this basement membrane, or the lamina propria that we see down here. So that makes it one cell layer thick. So that's why it's called pseudostratified. And those cilia are very critical in terms of what we call a mucus escalator within the respiratory tract. Okay, so we're working our way down and down and down through the bronchial tree, getting down to what we call the respiratory zone, where we have thin enough structures where we can actually exchange things across the wall. Again, very similar to the cardiovascular system, where we have large tubes that are just about conducting things from one place to another, and then smaller and smaller tubes where finally the walls are thin enough where we can exchange things across the wall. And here we see the overlap between, again, those alveoli, the simple squamous cell wall of the alveoli being surrounded by the simple squamous cell wall of the pulmonary capillaries. So it's just across this here, this thing that we call the respiratory membrane, where the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are going to be exchanging. All right, we do a little bit as well in terms of talking about the membranes and the cavities the lungs sit within, because that comes into play in terms of things like ventilation of the lungs. So ventilation is going to be inspiration, where the air is going into the lungs, as well as expiration, and it's going to be moved, the volume of air is going to be moved primarily by two forces: atmospheric pressure and what's called intrapulmonary pressure, which is also sometimes called intraalveolar pressure. So again, much like diffusion, osmosis, etc., molecules are going to tend to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And when we talk about pressure, it's how many of these things, of these molecules we have in a certain volume. So higher pressure is a higher concentration of those molecules in a relatively small space. Now, intrapleural pressure is also important, this pressure in the pleural cavity, but mainly making sure that the wall of the lung adheres to the wall of the cavity, because we're going to contract muscles that are going to move the wall of the cavity, and the lungs need to be able to follow and not hang limp in the pleural cavity. Alright, so you definitely need to know the role of these different pressures in ventilating the lungs. And there are some laws, some physics that comes into this. For me, it's not critical that you know the name of the law, but you do know what we're talking about when we describe these laws and how it has an influence on the respiratory system. You also need to know, as the bold terms indicate, the muscles involved in these different actions. Okay. Spirometer, wet spirometer, we will be measuring different lung volumes in the lab, so you get a chance to look like this guy with his little nose clip, etc. I'm sure you're excited. We'll talk about the different measurements that we make inside of the lab and what they mean. A typical spirometer would generate a graph like this, but this we'll go through in lecture, talking about the different, again, capacities or volumes that can be measured to assess pulmonary health. But remember, we have the four key processes. We have ventilation of the lungs, then we need to exchange with the blood, both in the pulmonary circuit and down the systemic circuit. So again, it involves more laws in terms of how to get these molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide to move across. Again, it has to do with concentration. So wherever these things are higher concentrated, for instance, the partial pressure or concentration of oxygen in the inspired air is pretty high, especially when we compare it to the blood coming to the alveolar capillaries, where we see its concentration is much, much lower. So according to that, we're going to get a movement of oxygen into the capillaries, and we're going to get carbon dioxide moving out of the capillaries. These are showing bar graphs here. We show a relatively high concentration of carbon dioxide coming to the lungs because we picked it up at the cells. But when we look at this freshly inhaled air, we see a relatively low concentration of carbon dioxide there. So carbon dioxide is going to move from where it's high to where it's low and go into the lungs. And then the reverse process is going to occur down here at the tissue level. Again, We're going to move oxygen from high to low, and it's going to go into the tissues. We're going to move carbon dioxide from high to low, and we're going to move it out of the tissues. Because carbon dioxide is being produced by aerobic respiration, so that's where it's highest. Now, that one of the four processes that we said we needed to know also was transport, both of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we need to know the major ways that they are transported in the blood. For oxygen, it's going to be attached to hemoglobin, but remember that with hemoglobin, it's going to be able to pick it up and release it at the appropriate time. So we get a little bit into that as well. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, can be bound to hemoglobin, but most of it is actually traveling as this ion called bicarbonate, floating around in the plasma itself. So you do need to know the different ways that these gases are transported in the blood, and you definitely need to know the equation that we see right here. This is going to be very important in the respiratory system. It's also going to be very important when we start talking about acids and bases. And what you see, sorry that I drew through it, is that there's an enzyme in red blood cells that facilitates the change of carbon dioxide in its native form, like you see here, into bicarbonate. And as we change it into bicarbonate, that's going to be the primary way that we are transporting it in the blood, in the plasma. And then when we get to, for instance, out to the respiratory system, up to the pulmonary capillaries, we're going to see that floating bicarbonate ion go into the red blood cells. Carbonic anhydrase is going to work the other way, producing carbon dioxide that we can then exhale into, if you will, the alveoli and get rid of. Towards the end, of course, with all these systems, we usually talk about how the nervous system coordinates it and controls it. Two primary areas that you'll find out about are in the brainstem, the pons and the medulla, where the pons basically oversees the direct activities that the medulla are having on the respiratory muscles, etc. And then towards the end, there are some diseases and disorders that are important that we'll highlight. And that's basically it for respiratory system. Like I said, fairly simple. And so I hope you find it a little bit easier than maybe the lymphatic or the immune system where we just came out of.